begin this hour from the U.S., where police have arrested a man suspected of killing 7 people during a 4th of July parade near Chicago. Well, the chief of police in Highland Park said the suspect was stopped by traffic officers but tried to flee. Police were able to detain him after a short pursuit. Well, he is accused of firing into a crowd of people from a rooftop using a high-powered rifle.
At this point in the investigation, and some of this is still preliminary, so is subject to change as we keep moving forward, but we do believe Cremo pre-planned this attack for several weeks. He brought a high-powered rifle to this parade. He accessed the roof of a business via a fire escape ladder and began opening fire on the innocent Independence Day celebration goers. The rifle was purchased in Illinois, and the information we have thus far is that it appears to have been purchased legally by Cremo.
We are now joined by Rise international correspondent Faith O, who is in New York. Faith, great to have you. So police now have the suspected shooter in custody. What more do we know about him?
We know that his name is Robert Cremo. He's 21 years old, and the police released quite a few details earlier when they held a press conference, including that he'd been preparing this attack for weeks and that he dressed as a woman. He disguised himself to slip away into the crowd after the shooting. They said that was to cover his facial tattoos. He even possibly wore a wig because witnesses describe him as having the longer hair. So we know that this was like quite a well-prepared event. It took police a number of hours to find him. When they eventually did, he of course tried to escape and then was finally apprehended, probably about 8 or 9 hours after the actual event happened. So he was on the loose all day. Now, they say that they tracked him down because he left the gun that he used on the roof, and it was legally purchased. So it was registered to him, it was registered to his address. So that was how they managed to track him down. He had a number of other weapons. They had all been purchased in the past couple of years. They were all legally purchased. They haven't charged him yet. The police were expected to give another update about 2 hours ago, but we haven't heard anything yet. They said that they're still working on the charges and that should be released today. What they are not sure of yet is the motive. They said that there's no indication that there's any sort of religious or racial motive behind this attack, but they're not clear why he did it. What we do know is that the suspect had been posting online, as of course so many of these shooters do. And he had posted music videos depicting himself with a rifle shooting into a crowd. Another video had shown him lying in a pool of blood surrounded by police officers. The mayor of Highland Park actually knew the shooter as a boy when she was his Cub Scout leader, and she says that she's just heartbroken by these events. We also heard from his uncle, who described him as a quiet, lonely man. He lived alone. He didn't have a job. None of his friends, he didn't, seem to have any friends come to visit him. Generally said he just kept to himself. But importantly, the uncle said there was no sign that this would happen. Police said the same, no previous criminal behaviour that would indicate something like this was about to take place.
Right, Faith, more questions being raised, honestly, because 22-year-old being allowed to have access to a high-powered rifle as it's been described by the police. But let's talk about the victims here, because we hear that the identities are now being reviewed and even more details about the shooting itself. Can you bring us up to speed with that?
So we now know the names of 2 of the victims. The first name to be released by a family was Nicholas Toledo. He was 78 years old. He was a grandfather. He's from Mexico. He was in town visiting his family. He was at the parade with his grandchildren. His granddaughter has spoken out about him, says that he loved fishing, he loved painting, going on walks with his family. He was there for around a month, just visiting with family. The other name that we've had released is Jackie Soontime. She was a former preschool teacher. She worked at the local synagogue. Her loved ones say that a kinder person you couldn't have met. She would have went out of her way to help absolutely anyone. Now, we've also heard from a doctor who was at the scene, because of course, besides the 7 people who died, one of whom was died today, so from the injuries sustained, another 38 were wounded. And the doctor who was treating people at the scene said that some of the injuries that he saw in people were what you would normally see on a battlefield, that it was just so many people wounded. Some of the bodies he described as being blown up. He said that some of it was just simply unspeakable, absolutely horrendous wounds. He said this is what you would see in victims of war, not victims in a parade. And he said that some people were killed within seconds.
And Faith, this is coming on the wake of mass shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde. Some gun control legislation has recently been passed, but people are saying more needs to be done. What more can America do?
So what they're saying is that some of the new measures have been passed, but it's very modest changes. So the mayor of Highland Park, for instance, she says the discussion should be about the fact that these weapons of war are on American streets. We also heard from Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois. He was the one who led, or was one of the people who led this recent bill that passed in the Senate. And what he said is it is an important step, but it doesn't cover everything. For instance, these military type weapons, he says, they're not used for sport, they're not used for hunting, they're not necessary, they're simply killing machines. And the fact that young men can access these high-powered rifles and just shoot anyone they like is something that's very worrying, and that is what people say needs to change. I mean, this wasn't even the only shooting on July the 4th. We saw 2 officers shot in Philadelphia and similar events, mass panic. Now, this is what the legislators are getting at. They say that, okay, changes are happening, but more needs to happen. That senator particularly described the events as an American tragedy and said that the day will be remembered by people for a very long time. He's urging people to vote, as so many other politicians are. He says, if you're traumatized by this, angry about it, furious about it, vote for people who feel the same way as you and who are going to do something about it. So that is what Americans are being told they can do to try and affect this sort of change, is vote for the people who are going to make the change.
Right, and Faith, of course, let's look at the fact that in 2022 alone, over 300 mass shootings so far, and 27 out of those were in schools. And it just tells us how bad this whole shooting is getting in the US. But, looking at the places where these things happen, like I've mentioned, schools, cinemas, even shopping malls, and now a 4th of July parade, do you get the sense that more Americans might start avoiding going out in public to avoid getting shot or even killed?
I think that's certainly true of some of the population. I mean, I actually heard one thing that was quite heartbreaking from one of the witnesses at the Illinois shooting. He said his young son turned to him after it and asked if there was going to be a shooter at every July 4th parade. And it just shows you how normalised it's become, especially for children. A lot of the children reacted quicker than the adults in this shooting because they'd had active shooter training. They threw themselves to the ground, they took shelter. They had been taught what to do. And it is just heartbreaking that these children consider this something that they've trained for, that's normal. We also have heard from, again, that doctor who treated people. He has said that he thinks people need to change the behaviour, and he is going to avoid parades, avoid sporting events, really restrict doing the things he loves until this is brought under control, this epidemic of gun violence is brought under control. He says it's simply too big a risk to go to these major events when this sort of level of violence is happening. There's lots of people saying a similar thing. I mean, many people will carry on with their lives as normal. Of course, we would expect that. But many others, they're scared to put their children to nursery. They're scared to put their children to school. They're scared to go to the grocery, supermarket. And it's these American rituals of life that are really affected. So as I said, for many, they'll carry on. But for others, it's simply not worth the risk anymore.
It is truly heartbreaking to see what's happening and the lives of children being turned around this way. Thank you so much, Arise International correspondent Faith Orr from New York there.